When you hear the name Steve Jobs, you probably think of one thing: success. But what if I told you the most important part of his story, the part that truly defined him, wasn't about winning at all? It was about being rejected, cast out, and fired from the very company he built from scratch.
So, yeah, this isn't going to be your typical success story. We're going to look at something much more real, much more human, and honestly, way more powerful.
Because to really, truly understand the man who wanted to put a dent in the universe, you first have to understand how the universe seemed to reject him again and again. This is the story of a founder who was literally thrown out of his own creation, only to come back and not just save it, but to completely redefine our future. It's a story about failure, exile, and in the end, an incredible redemption. And you know what's wild? This whole pattern of rejection, it didn't start with Apple. Nope. It started the very day he was born. So back in 1955, his biological parents gave him up for adoption. He was raised by Paul and Clara Jobs. Later on, he gets into this great school, Reed College, but after just one semester, he drops out. He just felt it was a pointless waste of his parents' hard-earned money. But he didn't actually leave. He stuck around, sleeping on floors and auditing classes that just sparked his curiosity. One of them was calligraphy, a seemingly random choice that, believe it or not, would later shape the entire aesthetic of personal computing. Then, in 1976, it all starts. In his parents' garage, with his friend Steve Wozniak.
And from that garage, he builds an empire. The rise of Apple wasn't just fast, it was meteoric. It was a revolution that put him on the map as the face of modern innovation.
First, there was the Apple II, which brought computers into ordinary homes. Then, the IPO in 1980 made a lot of people very, very rich. And then came the Macintosh, the machine he was convinced would change everything. The success was absolutely explosive, but there was a dark side to it. His famous passion, his drive for perfection, it started to morph into something else. A brutal, controlling management style that created some serious cracks inside the company he loved.
And that tension, well, it was a ticking time bomb. The visionary who started this whole thing was about to be made an outcast.
The year is 1985. You have to understand, Apple wasn't just a company to Steve Jobs. It was his baby. It was his entire identity. But after a bitter and public power struggle with John Sculley, the CEO that Steve himself had recruited, the board took a side, and it wasn't his. The decision was final.
He was fired from Apple, the company he had poured his soul into.
Just try to imagine that. You're 30 years old, you're the wonderkind of Silicon Valley, and you are publicly, completely, and utterly defeated. The rejection couldn't have been more absolute. But this right here, what happened next, this is the whole point of the story. His time away wasn't an end. It was a crucible. This period of so-called failure became the most defining and productive time of his entire life. So what's so fascinating here is you see these two different sides of his growth. With Next, he doubled down on technology. The computers themselves didn't really sell, but the software inside them, Next Step, was an absolute masterpiece. It was so good it would eventually become the heart of every Mac and iPhone. And then there was Pixar. He bought it for next to nothing, and with Pixar, he learned something totally different. He learned about storytelling. He learned patience. He learned how to trust other creative geniuses. So you see, Next built the technology, but Pixar built the leader.
So fast forward a decade. Apple, the company he built, is on life support. It is dying. And in one of the greatest plot twists in business history, the only person who could save them was the guy they kicked to the curb.
By 1997, Apple was an absolute disaster. It had this bloated, confusing lineup of products, no real direction, and it was just hemorrhaging money. We're talking maybe 90 days from going completely broke.
So, in this incredible moment of irony, Apple buys Next. But let's be honest, they weren't just buying the technology. They were buying back their founder. The exile was over.
And look at this. It shows you everything about the man he had become. He didn't come back bitter. He came back with a laser focus. He took Apple's sprawling, chaotic product line and just, boom, simplified it to this. An elegant 4-box grid. One great product for each type of customer. That's it. It was pure clarity out of chaos.
He also knew he had to do more than just fix the products. He had to save Apple's soul. As someone who had been an outsider himself, he knew the power of that identity. The Think Different campaign wasn't just advertising. It was a mission statement. It was a rallying cry for the rebels, the misfits, the creators, the very people Apple was meant for. It reminded the world, and more importantly, Apple itself, what it stood for.
And with that foundation firmly in place, his second act began. And what an act it was. One after another, he unveiled a series of products that didn't just compete in markets, they created them entirely. The iPod, iTunes, the iPhone, the iPad. The vision, sharpened and perfected by failure, was finally fully realized.
So when you step back and look at the whole picture, his life began with rejection. His education was a rejection of the traditional path, and the centerpiece of his career was the ultimate rejection, getting fired from his own company.
And yet, not one of those things was the end of the story. They were just redirections. They were the harsh, painful lessons that success could have never, ever taught him.
He boiled this entire incredible journey down into these 4 simple words. It's a challenge to all of us, really. To never lose our curiosity, and to never be so afraid of failing that we don't try something that seems, a little foolish.
We tend to see rejection as a verdict, as the end of the road. But Steve Jobs' story shows us it can just be a detour, a redirection. It proves that sometimes our greatest setbacks are what forge our greatest strengths. So the question that leaves for all of us is this: what's the biggest lesson you can take from your next setback?